Hello, good afternoon. Hope you can all hear me well. It's a pleasure to be here on this FIS Week panel. Such a rich debate and so contemporary to health for us to think about these themes of health today. Um, I have an even greater pleasure for moderating this conversation about such a relevant theme, mental health. We have somehow already been introduced and talking. I work with customer experience and in after sales. And then I will talk about the feeling of being here. So we and my company has the mission of helping people to be healthier. So we only thought of a sane body, so sound body. Now we need to have also a sound mind. So compassion, and mental health are closely related. This is very important. It's an honor to be here. So Philip, you could talk about your feelings, and then Natalia, for them, for us to warm up for the conversation that we are going to have. Please just send us your questions or your comments and we'll talk about them. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in this conference. This is my first high-scale conference. I'm really very happy to be here. And talking about mental health is something that is necessary, something that has become increasingly more important recently, and people have been asking. So this act of compassion, empathy, and giving voice to us healthcare workers and people who need it, this is very important. So I'm very happy to be here. Now you, Natalia. Well, just as Felipe, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Well, and as a psychologist in my background, mental health worker, this is a very important and valuable theme for me, especially in this context, in here now, everything that we have been doing now in dealing with the pandemic, and in the social mobilization for us to have this theme that is becoming increasingly augmented. And Amil is very much for this need of mental health care, maintenance of mental health. And as this is something that is so important to me as a professional, and it is very important socially speaking for the entire society, I'm very happy to be here and to contribute with you for this conversation. I'm sure this is going to be a really great conversation. Great, Natalia. Well, it will certainly be. And what you have said is related to a few things that I'm going to mention to warm up. We say a lot that mental health is very important now, but Felipe, we feel that this has become more severe. Where does it come from? Could you share with us which are the behaviors, you who know a lot about the theme, that you see that our society presents and that they are making mental health be so important? What are the indications of worsening of mental health, and then close with the pandemic? How much has the pandemic contributed to that? Well, first of all, we seek the perfection of our activities and our day-to-day activities. So we are increasingly more focused on immediate results in terms of meeting our needs in the short term, considering our culture. So for example, here in Brazil, and we need to work, we have many activities, you need to look after family. And especially in talking about the pandemic. So people need to look after many different tasks, and they seek perfection, uncertainty. So when we talk about the pandemic, both before and now after the pandemic, there is great uncertainty of what is yet to come, and all the day-to-day impacts, functional losses in a day-to-day, and the work. And then somehow, um, and also transportation is stressful, whether it is by car, bus, or subway. And so this has really contributed to anxiety in terms of trying to have things, uh, because the day-to-day is very much rushed. And all of this affects many things. For example, sleep patterns, diet, and all day-to-day activities are interfering more and more in the day-to-day. So there's an automatic behavior. And so people say, I'm stressed every day, and it's just the traffic. But it's a little bit of stress today, more stress tomorrow, and it snowballs until it gets really great. And then people have a more aggressive behavior, not physically speaking, but verbally too. And this, I joke, it's a stress that interferes and it's kind of contagious. So people are stressed at home and then they stress the person who live with them, and this is augmented. So the lack of communication, the lack of assertive communication, and all of this becomes a behavior, and this has increases stress more and more, that is augmented by signals of anxiety, sometimes even burnout, which is very common today while people work, and this may also interfere in this behavior. So it's very important to try and find a mental health worker to provide guidance, to align behaviors, and to pay attention and try, for example, not to think that a psychologist would be a problem, but it's just regular care. It's like going to a cardiologist or neurologist. We also need to look after our mental health, and the body may answer to that with physiological responses. And you're even talking about that, this body-mind integration for mental health. You mentioned perfection. And so we need to be well. And sometimes there's a certain distress. Is distress correlated to mental health, and how much? Well, Rita, and then if we want to have a conversation and talking to each other, so there are social determinants for social health. And now how much the fact of us living in society has it affects us both positively and negatively. And so all of this has contributed for the stress to change. So the stress decades ago looked different from what it looks today. Today we have different sources of the stress. And this is very much related to the times we are living. So what you mentioned about the pandemic and the day-to-day stress shows how mental health cannot be understood without looking at the context. We need to look at the broader context, and we need to look at all health determinants too that interfere and impact mental health. And it's great what you say. This issue of suffering is very much mistaken, And here I am going to try and simplify a little bit so that we don't get into so much detail, but bringing it down to a more practical aspect. So people who are not in the area, for example, the feeling of pain, distress, anxiety, sadness, they're inherent to being human. So the mere fact of us being humans and being inserted in a context in our society already makes us vulnerable to feel these things. And sometimes it's more positive and we are interested, but also feelings that are around what we understand as negative, which would be uh, pain, sadness, frustration. So all of this is cannot be avoided. It's impossible not to feel any of those feelings. So this is part of our constitution, of our nature. They are necessary for the development of our psyche. Once we are dealing with a more difficult situation that causes distress, so we develop tools to overcome. And then we develop ourselves. And I hear a lot about that, mentioning issues like that. So very difficult situations in life. And then a space is open for a new strategy, a different eye, a different perception about oneself and the world. So these feelings cannot be avoided. So with this need of control, we tend to believe that we will be able to control everything, even what we feel. And no, we cannot do that. We won't be able to do that. We will be able to develop strategies to deal with what we feel. But this control, we can't control life. So pain, suffering, distress, everything. So there is a feeling, a difference between these feelings and suffering. Suffering through distress. Suffering is when we are stuck with just a feeling. We feel pain and we only feel pain. When we are in contact with pain, when we can't see any way out. So this can turn into suffering. And how much this impacts this person on a day-to-day in terms of day-to-day functionality and how they understand it. And this may lead to mental suffering. So it's just something that is common for everyone, all these feelings that we experience. It's not just because I am sad that I am depressed. I hear people mistake that a lot. But depression is something that when sadness becomes a suffering, that gains a dimension in the lives without any tools to overcome and deal with suffering there and then. And it might be at a different time, but there were no tools, something that will lead to greater suffering. So suffering, yes, it is related to mental health. So once we cannot work through it, that's when we may become sick. And today, uh, and I need to be mindful of time because I speak a lot, but today, suffering gains new faces. There are new ways of suffering, very much related to contemporary society and all the social modifications that have happened. One example is this ideal of perfection. So we are living in a context where being perfect is different from what it used to be, and this ideal of perfection institutes a need for us and a social requirement for the way we look, so bodies, the way we dress. So there is something that is socially accepted and we need to fit in. professional success. So we also have an idea of the meaning of success, and we try to fit into those things. And many times, all of this is unattainable. We are projecting a superhuman in terms of the way you look, professional life, personal life, intelligence. And this might not be suitable to a person. So this idealized superhuman, so this figure no longer considers that there is pain, distress, frustration. On the superhuman, there is no room for suffering. It is true. This is the territory uh, of attaining your maximum potential in every sphere of your life. That is not really realistic. That really drives you to a progress. There is some stagnation, something we cannot move forward. And now I have a next question for Felipe. Are there any warning signs? What people say is know thyself. How can self-knowledge help us as a tool to deal better with these symptoms? How can self-knowledge make a difference? I perceiving myself within this context. Does this help in any way? Well, self-knowledge is just the skill that someone has. It's a set of skills to deal with certain situations. So the whole process of holiness that people consider perfection is being whole. Not necessarily, in spite of the difficulties, acknowledging your limitations on a day to day. I can't do this. This is difficult for me. It's not a sign of weakness. And this is what people say, culturally speaking, especially in our the day, which is very sexist, where men cannot feel pain, men cannot cry. So this acknowledgement and all the potentials as a human being on a day to day, there is a certain frailty, and acknowledging this frailty. So, and how can we understand that? Well, I cannot work until 8 p.m. because I am very tired. So admitting your limitations, tiredness, this is the beginning. The same thing with relationships, social relationships that we need. We are source of relationships. We are social people. So understanding, hearing or a no, or being able to say no. So the importance of no, of keeping something, it's a way of acknowledging our limitations. So it's important to take out some time in your day to day and to actually think, how was your day? Your emotions, what you felt, the barriers. So there was an activity, an expectation and frustration. So this leads to sadness because we can't control our emotions. So first of all, trying to have full control of our emotions is impossible. So we have failures. We are just human beings. So writing down your limitations, what we are doing on a day-to-day that is interfering in my performance at work, with my family. Well, my family is telling me that I'm very anxious, I'm stressed. I have no time for a leisure on a weekend. So think of what happened, have a feeling, what I felt there and then. Because when we put things down to paper, we put it down and we look. It's different from when you think and then the thought goes away and then the behavior becomes automatic. So this helps a lot to understand that. So having clarity, and the brain activates the limbic system and behaviors and our memory. So look, on the same day, every day at this time, for example, what an awful week. Was the week really awful? Was just a specific moment that made my week terrible. So having the behavior of self-monitoring, and so thinking of your physiological responses and mindfulness, we need to keep mindful of our behaviors, of the day to day. Everything is so intense. So when you're 18, you need to go to college. When you're 20, you need to have a relationship, need to get married, have children. So there's the perfection. We go back to this need of perfection, and the person is under control of external standards, the environment, people, what people expect from you. So what I need to do, what will my boss think? And this is a major barrier for self-knowledge. Know thyself, know your limitations, your feelings, frustrations. All of this is very important for you to move on with a life with more quality. So that's why it's so important to have some psychological help, because psychologists help us to create our strategies and this self-knowledge, all these skills to deal with difficult situations and to understand this is very difficult. It's much easier to understand others, the behavior of others, and recognize in the behaviors of others what they should change or something. This is natural. That's why psychologists also need to be seen by other psychologists. This is very important.
Well, trying to understand the others, it always seems to be easier than looking ourselves in the mirror. Let me now change gears here. Natalia, let's see if it's something from a generation perspective. Do you think mental health is something specific to a age range, or is anyone really prepared for it? What can you tell me about the generation perspective with mental health? Such an interesting question, Lizia. So what makes different age ranges suffer? And is there anyone subject to more mental health or mental disorders than others? Well, I don't think we can limit it to age ranges, to gender, or to social stratum. It's impossible to say that only young people or only people over 50 will be subject to suffering. It, anyone may be subject to it regardless of its age or condition. And this is also observed in the number of diagnoses in mental health. All age ranges may be affected. Based on the literature, we know that young female adults from lower income groups tend to get more mental disorders. So female young adults from low and mid income level groups. in the 360-degree mental health program of Amil, where we have chronic patients. Out of the 5,000 beneficiaries who are followed up by us, there is a predominance of female gender. 71% of the 5,000 are women. So women are seeking for help, and at the same time, because of vulnerability of female gender, we might be more subject to suffering. The average age is 41 years in our program. I think that the population today is asking for help, crying for help, and it's quite obvious, and that applies to children and adolescents. I think that this age range has presented a significant increase in severe mental health disorders. We have been monitoring that in-house, and we can also see the literature reporting it. We tend to get patients who are at moments of crisis, so they suffer self-mutilation. Some of them have attempted a suicide, and there is a higher prevalence of these cases than we used to have in the past. When you were speaking about the difference in generations, this is something that stood out. There has been an increasing number of cases of mental disorders among children and adolescents. In addition to the profile of the population that we have normally seen. I don't know if I am repeating myself when I mention the pandemic again, but I think it really impacts mental health. And we will definitely continue to feel the impact of the pandemic. It was not social distance, it was physical. It was some staying away from the people. So we were fighting stay at home as a way to prevent COVID-19 dissemination. But our generation had never experienced that. And we just learned by doing it. Many people just got socially isolated. They stopped develop their relationships. And as such, they had no more opportunity to interact with peers at school or in with friends. So it was just something limited to video game and a smartphone, thanks to the digital technology. Is it good? Well, fine. These children needed to release energy, which was through the technology. But what we do when we interact through the screen, as we are doing today, is very different from being on site, especially when we think about affection. We tend not to get very affected by what happens on the other side of the screen. But if you tell me a story right now, I would probably feel it different and as differently from a situation in which we are eye to eye, one next to the other. So there is something along these lines. Interpersonal connection, which has been lost, especially in children and adolescents during the pandemic. And I believe it might have been one of the factors that have increased the curve of mental health diagnosis among children and adolescents. We also see the older generation parents of those children showing a very low threshold for frustration. If my child didn't do that and someone else's child did, so there is a problem there. So I'm going to take him to the psychologist because he has a problem. It is, well, we have this ideal of perfection. And if the child does not comply with the model as is, we might wonder there is something wrong with our child. So if it doesn't fit the model of perfection, probably there is a disease, probably there is a disability. And we have to bear in mind that we are all unique people. Therefore, this is something important to understand. Generations are always exposed to suffering. Some of them are transgenerational. The same feeling or symptom can go on from generation to generation. And say, well, when I listen to a story like that, I get sad. Well, my mother's just like that. So as if it were, let's say, a legacy that goes from generation to generation. My point is mental health is a reality and to all of us, regardless of age range, gender, orientation, and social income. Well, Natalia, Felipe, such an enriching conversation, both for the individual understanding. It's important to understand that everyone can be affected by that. And now we are going to our last 5 minutes, but there is one question, and I'm going to ask Felipe to answer it. With mental health, we started hearing a lot about burnout. Now everyone talks about it. What is exactly burnout? Let's have a corporate understanding of it, not only thinking about individual needs, but also a corporate world. Please, Felipe, tell us about that. What is exactly burnout, the burnout syndrome, and how can companies pay attention to it? We cannot hear you, Felipe. I think you are on mute. Still cannot hear you. Cannot hear you. So Natalia starts it. Natalia, would you go first, telling us about burnout? Felipe? Oh, yes, now we can hear you. Good. So you go. We can hear you now. Sorry, just a problem here on my computer. Good. I restarted the page and now it's working. I apologize. Well, first of all, managers, peers, everyone should pay attention to the functional capability of a person. Well, I've always been dedicated. I've always enjoyed what I do. How come I am not working as hard as I used to, or why am I not working with the same will and energy as I used to? I don't feel like executing anything. Tend to postpone activities, so answer an email later or do something else. And peers ask for help. Coworkers say, "Can you please help me?" And say, "Well, maybe later." It starts with some basic physiological responses. Fatigue, someone who's always tired, cannot sleep during the night because it's concerned about the day. Well, tomorrow I have emails and meetings, and then the person gets just so concerned, has an increase in heartbeat, muscle tension, which tends to start at the region of the neck. And what should we do? Well, there is a constant work overload in small, mid, or large size companies, especially in this world of the pandemic. Some small sized companies had significant financial loss, had to cut on labor. So we have to start thinking about emotional health. The employee is also a human being. It's someone who has life beyond work. There might be a number of difficulties going on in his or her life, and it has been influencing the work. So this physiological and emotional overload will impact productivity. Therefore, we have to observe with compassion the person and also observe relationship among the team members. A company that has such values in mind and see human beings as a whole will be able to detect behavioral traits. Some people think that you have to make friends with everyone, but that's not the case. You need compassion, empathy, support. So get together, uh, just chat, you know. I know it's working. I know we just have so much on our plates, but uh, interact and talk. And managers are also subject to burnout. So I think that working together as a team, managers and employees, is extremely important. Maybe invite someone to talk about that, to provide some psycho education, explain what can be done. We can come up with projects to create a more welcoming environment and not a company that simply has to produce results no matter what. Of course, there are goals, there are expected results, but we really have to consider the human being as a whole. If the person is not working as well as before, if it's not interacting and communicating, uh, is the person going through difficulties really? So we have to show empathy. We have to have active listening and really get in contact with this emotional side of the person. This is really important. Actively listening and providing a constructive feedback. Really understanding what's going on with the person. This is absolutely essential, similarly to any other human relation. Understanding, listening to each other and understanding. Active listening is something very important. We were here just to shed some light to an ongoing topic. I think it was such an interesting conversation. I hope that has been the case of all our participants. Something that has really uh, impacted us and can really serve as input to all of us, because you were giving us a number of pearls, a number of hints that can be used for us to go from perception to action. Well, time's up, but it's been amazing. I've learned so much, and I hope it has been the case for everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address mental health and think about a more powerful society, thinking about health and all the aspects. Thank you very much, everyone. Felipe, Natalia, for your contributions, and thank you for the event. I hope it has been also useful to all of us, and thank you for your questions. Have a good afternoon and stay tuned with FIS Week schedule. Thank you very much.